You want to say hi? Hey, Loki, you want to say hi? Look at that little face. You want to go? Okay, bye. Hi folks, welcome to my channel, or welcome back. My name is Kat. I'm a licensed registered dietitian nutritionist and online nutrition coach. I focus in on sports nutrition, gut health, and prenatal nutrition, as well as overall practices that support physical, mental, social, and emotional well-being. It's been a little while. I've been really exhausted these last several weeks. If you're watching this when this comes out, or even later on, happy Pride Month. I am very excited about talking about the topic today. I'm excited to chat about it because generally it's a little more controversial. We are talking about health at every size and just how messy our history is when it comes to bodies and body shapes and sizes and types. So let's go. Race and privilege. We are talking about that today. And we honestly need to talk about it if we want to move forward when we're talking about just social health in general on a public scale. Because just talking about what to eat and how to move doesn't really help anything on a deep level. On this channel, we often talk about the social determinants of health, which I know angers some people. I've had people comment announcing their departure from being a subscriber as if they were a plane leaving the airport because of me talking about social determinants of health and the privileges within them. All right, so first up, I want to focus on a little bit of our history in this world regarding body shape and size. This book is what we are diving into first. It's written by Dr. Sabrina Strings, who is an associate professor of sociology at the University of California in Irvine. As a side note, Dr. Strings' resume and her work is just amazing, and this book is seriously one of my favorite books in my collection of nutrition and health related books. It's really infuriating at many parts when reading this book, but it's still really important to know about our history and kind of where we're at currently with how we see body shapes and sizes and the desire for specific shapes and sizes and what the history of that looks like. If you have any interest in that whatsoever, I highly recommend it. And if anybody is doing any kind of work in any of the areas or the fields that we're talking about today, I honestly think it's kind of like required reading. It is really, really good. So I obviously can't sit here and read all of the important parts of this book because, I mean, you see all of the different tabs and just notes that I have from here. It would be like reading the whole book, but I really want to share some of the parts that stand out to me or that stood out to me that also give kind of an idea of what the culture looked like at that specific time frame. Okay, so the fear of the imagined fat black woman was created by racial and religious ideologies and has been used to degrade black women and also discipline white women. That is a very brief kind of overview of what this book really dives into. So I'm going to read a couple of things from the book itself, and it starts out with talking about aesthetics in the Renaissance time frame or time period. She writes, a great deal of info has been written about the aesthetic standards for women during the Renaissance. The literature shows that larger, fleshier physiques were prized and considered attractive. But it wasn't just the size. Proportionate and well-rounded physiques were admired and believed to reveal something of beauty and mystery of divinity. And if a woman had to err on one side of the scale, it was generally preferred to be on the heavier side than be on the side that one might label as thin or bony. By the turn of the 17th century, black women were shifting from the aesthetic counterparts of European women to their aesthetic counterpoints. Per Dr. Strings, their novelty having worn off in areas where the slave trade had been going on the longest, and black women's figures were being described as inferior. The plump aesthetic became more and more frequently associated with white women, and at the same time in England, which was a country that arrived relatively late to the transatlantic slave trade, a new trend was taking off among refined men, and that was thinness. In English high society, philosophers had started to rethink the meaning of the fat male body. Voluptuousness in women was all well and good. Women were the objects of men's fancies, but fatness and men signaled lack of self-control or dimness. For elite men, slenderness became bodily proof of rationality and intelligence. So in the 17th century, basically that concern over ascetic, which is a person who practices that kind of severe self-discipline, was over the concern of aesthetic itself. The concern for that over aesthetic drove the distaste for overall fat male bodies. The stereotype that Black people were sexually and orally indulgent quickly gained traction. During that time in the 17th century, the perceptions that Africans freely gratified their animal appetites was expressed by some of the most elite members of the English high society. That's just one of the examples where I started to get really upset and just enraged at the thought processes of what these people were thinking. Moving forward, again in 1749, according to Buffon, so he was an author of a book titled Of the Varieties in the Human Species. So this is what it says. The plumpness of Black Africans was evidence of their ease of circumstance and idleness. The land inhabited by them, he claimed, was rich, abounding in pasturage and millets and in trees always green. For this reason, in his opinion, Black Africans were able to stay well nourished with little or no effort, which made them well fed but also simple and stupid. Buffon's linking of fatness to laziness and slow-wittedness was in harmony with the ideas of the intellectuals in England of that thinness equals smartness. Then now moving into the early Enlightenment in England, women would have new reasons to be concerned for their weight. Several English philosophers and moralists were beginning to draft revisions to the standards of taste, which included that reconfiguration of aesthetic ideals. So the height of beauty, they suggested, should reflect the nation's moral compass as well as its racial caliber. Anything that could be construed as evidence of gluttony, they claimed, was beneath them. She mentions this person, Cheyenne, who wrote about health and nutrition, and Cheyenne's wish was that women would scrub their diets of any unholy excess, and if they had to fast and purge to transform their bodies into a temple for the Lord, so be it. There was another person, a woman, who also wrote about health and nutrition, and she found it no less her duty to instruct her female readers as how to behave properly before the eyes of God. A central theme as it pertained to questions of correct conduct was temperance in eating and drinking. Now, scooting forward again in time, a name that is probably familiar, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. Yes, from the Kellogg family, the cereal. Kellogg published multiple books and dozens of articles. Much of his early work dated back to the mid-1870s and could be found in the publication of Western Health Reform Institute, which changed its name later on to Good Health. Dr. Strings writes that in them one can find more of Kellogg's thoughts on diets, as well as insights as to how temperance among Black and Indigenous peoples proved to be lower on the scale of humanity, according to him. He is quoted as saying, "The South is for prohibition because it has forced to be recognized that given whiskey, the Black person is made a beast. The white man intoxicated sinks low enough in the bestial scale, but not so low as the Black person or the Indian." And he was a doctor. He was a member of the American Public Health Association and the American Medical Association within a few years of getting his medical degree in 1875. These were who the doctors were. These were the teachers of doctors not too long ago. And Dr. Strings continues to write this book up to talking about the BMI, how that was created, discussing the ideal body weight that was created by an insurance company, along with other more recent issues. So much of medicine is evidence-based, and I love that. I love being part of that community, being a health professional, but we're really not that far removed from some really bad, harmful, just plain wrong information. And we need to recognize that and learn about the history, where medicine was. When you have a history that has for so long been soaked in racism, and you look at who the teachers were and who the leaders were not that long ago, we need to talk about racism in other areas of medicine and in health in general. We need to find out how all of those harmful beliefs find their way into current medicine, into current health practices. And the more that we just kind of push it away and say that was our history, it doesn't exist anymore, that is putting blinders on and is just such a privileged point of view of looking at medicine. I mean, even in nutrition, lab values, something that I learned when I was in school that they were still teaching was the difference between GFRs and what they called African American GFRs, which those are lab values that we look at when people have chronic kidney disease or just kidney disease in general. And so even that lab value is currently being looked at by kidney researchers. You have people in power who are of a culture of European thinness for religious purposes in the driver's seat of some conventional medicine foundations. So that is a very brief overview. Check out Dr. String's book because it is so important to know the history of this and why we have this kind of focus in on thinness, which we'll continue to talk about, but it kind of lays that foundation really, really well. So now moving into more of health at every size and what that even is. So the movement started around the 1960s. We can find information about people talking about it, being about it in the 1960s. You might be wondering, like, what is so bad about dieting? Shouldn't we promote health? Shouldn't I, as a health professional, as a dietitian, want to have people be healthier and therefore lose weight? Decades of research show that the pursuit of weight loss rarely produces that thin kind of dream life that a lot of diets and diet companies sell. Now, before moving forward, I want to be clear on what the definition of diet that we are talking about. Yes, everybody has a diet, is on a diet, has a dietary intake. A diet can mean a way of eating. That's not what we're talking about. We're also not talking about any kind of medical nutrition therapy, which is evidence-based medical approaches that we implement in order to manage either acute or chronic health conditions. We are talking about diets that relate to a course of action that is done typically for aesthetic or sometimes even like health purposes. We know that dieting or putting ourselves into a caloric deficit can actually increase our hunger drive. It can lower our metabolism and trigger other kind of weight gain mechanisms that are beyond our control. It can also trigger disordered eating or full-blown eating disorders. And you might be like, okay, what's the big deal? Not everybody who diets gets an eating disorder. Maybe you're like, I've dieted and I'm fine. I don't have an eating disorder. Unfortunately, eating disorders, specifically anorexia nervosa, is the most lethal mental disorder. And just thinking about how we are in regards to getting treatment for mental health disorders, at least in the United States, it's not something that we want to spur on. The fact that it is the highest lethal mental health disorder and we know what is triggering it, why are we going to promote that and like pursue potentially triggering that? Especially when we'll talk about later, this is not about health. There are so many ways that we can go about improving health that don't require being on this kind of like diet plan. So we can't even say that, well, we're doing it for health purposes, and if somebody gets a mental health disorder, oh well, we can support health in a way that doesn't have to do anything with a dieting kind of program, like what we're talking about and what Hayes is not in support of. And even without having a full-blown eating disorder, in general, having body dysmorphia, having fear around certain food, overall an unhealthy relationship with food, that can stay with somebody for a very long time and can be so much work and so hard to work through. And that is something that we also see spurred on by these kind of diets. So health at every size, it's not something that is being speculated. It's not a movement to help people like feel better about themselves. There are some amazing journal articles about health at every size. I'll leave a good amount linked down below in the description. I'm going to pull a couple of information pieces, or I don't know if that's the right way to say it. I'm going to read a couple of things from Dr. Lindo Bacon's book, Health at Every Size. This is not the end-all be-all of Health at Every Size. That's just the title of it. In their book, they talk about how there has been quite a bit of research on the topic of dieting. It's not just that we're finding that dieting doesn't work long term. It might actually push your set point weight up. So this is also known as weight cycling. So the idea of losing 10 pounds, gaining 15 pounds, losing 20, gaining 25, losing 30, gaining 35. Essentially dieting your way up to a higher weight than what you were like originally at. So people end up weighing more than they would have weighed if they hadn't have dieted in the first place. In general, what we see diets do is slow the rate at which your body burns calories, increase the body's efficiency at wringing out every possible calorie in the food, trying to get as much energy as it can from the food, increases appetite, reduces energy levels. So even if you could burn more calories through movement, you might not want to because your energy is so much lower. Also lowering body temperature, so you're using less energy, and as a side effect, potentially cold. Also reduces your ability to feel hunger and fullness, making it easier to confuse hunger with emotional needs versus a physical hunger. Reducing total amount of muscle tissue, lean body mass that we don't want to reduce, and increases fat storage enzymes and decreases fat release enzymes. So the message here is not to blame yourself about diets if you have experienced any kind of weight cycling. It's not you that failed. Like when you look at dieters in general, they show so much willpower and perseverance, self-control, determination, but it's not you, or it's not the person that is doing anything wrong. It's not the person who is failing, it's the diet that is failing. You weren't the problem, the diet was the problem. So this leads into the obesity epidemic and why so many people are just like hyper focused on reducing this obesity epidemic. So I'm going to read from Dr. Lindo Bacon's book. More than 400,000 Americans die of overweight and obesity every year. Soon that may surpass smoking as the leading cause of preventable death. So that's what the CDC told us in the prestigious Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA. Their report grabbed headlines and it was helped along by dramatic and very well distributed press releases from the CDC and JAMA that resulted in tens of thousands of citations in popular press and thousands more in scientific journals. But an updated federal report acknowledged that the analysis suffered from computational errors. Using better methodology and newer data, CDC epidemiologists were able to reduce the estimate, determining that obesity only associated with an excess of 111,909 excess deaths versus the over 400,000 originally stated. And the actual excess deaths in the obesity category were clustered in the more extreme range, greater ranges, and going back to dieting and weight cycling. This is anecdotal in my experience. The people who I have seen at those higher numbers, they typically have a very extensive dieting history and have dieted their way up there, or have a lot of other traumatic history, reasons why they got up to beyond that range. They need a different kind of support. Now, Dr. Lindo Bacon also mentions that it's important to know that when the National Institute of Health Obesity Task Force were updating their information regarding BMI, at least 7 of the 9 members of the task force were directors of weight loss clinics, and most had multiple financial relationships with private industry in weight loss. There's a lot of money in this field, in this industry. There is a reason why people would want to have this kind of war on obesity. You're selling off people's fears and their insecurities of this war on obesity. A considerable portion of people at a healthy weight are prone to cardiac and metabolic abnormalities that we tend to blame on that term obesity. And in my opinion, the more that we focus on those conditions and how they're tied to weight, the less actual help that we can do in reducing those numbers of people who experience those cardiac and metabolic abnormalities. And what I mean by this is I have had so many people who I have worked with at a healthy weight who all of a sudden found themselves having some kind of cardiac or metabolic abnormality that they did not expect, that took them by surprise because they were at that healthy weight. Because we don't hear so much about how we can promote or reduce the risk of those conditions. We just hear about lose weight and exercise. So you have a lot of people, who are feeling like they're safe from getting those kind of conditions because they're at this healthy weight, when in reality, they can still get those if they're not doing actions that generally support their physical health. Just a quick note, we can also get these from having a very healthy lifestyle. We can't always prevent these. Cardiovascular disease or hypertension, diabetes, other metabolic conditions, autoimmune conditions, we can't always prevent these. And I just wanted to make that very, very clear. We can do what we can to have habits that support that prevention side, but we cannot always prevent them. And just because you have or will get one of these conditions or know somebody who has them, that does not mean that they did it to themselves. It is never something to blame yourself over. I think we need to refocus on what are the actual actions that promote that physical health that also don't impact those other aspects of health negatively. And just saying to diet and exercise, that doesn't fit. And going through weight loss and regain can actually damage blood vessels. Damaging blood vessels can increase your risk for cardiovascular disease. And so if we know that can happen, why are we focusing so much on reducing that weight and not focusing on those actions that we know reduces those risk factors versus doing something that maybe it does reduce some of those risk factors in some cases, but that gives so much of that higher increase of regaining the weight and being in a worse place physically. And I'm not talking about being in a worse place physically because of like aesthetic ideals or anything. It's completely not talking about that. I'm talking about the damage that weight cycling can do on the body, the damage to metabolism, hunger and fullness cues, but also very physically. So while someone at a higher weight can very well have cardiovascular disease, it can actually be dieting that helped to make that happen. And it's not just that, like weight cycling, weight fluctuation in general, and I'm not talking about the kind of standard weight fluctuation that we all do. We all see even, within a day, depending on what we've eaten, if we've had a bowel movement, how our water intake has been, like talking about weight fluctuation from diets. That is strongly associated with an increased risk in diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, independent of body weight. And what I really love, what I really like to focus in on and use from an evidence-based perspective is the fact that there is an abundance of research indicating improvement through nutrition and activity habits independent of weight loss. We can improve those things. We can reduce the risk of those things. And also, it is pretty well established generally that people who are of a higher weight are typically from either of lower socioeconomic status or a historically marginalized community, both of which are highly associated with disease risk in general. We talk about this often on this channel when we talk about the social determinants of health. And of course, experiencing chronic stress from things like discrimination and other things when we're talking about those social determinants of health. that has a very real impact on our physical health, not just our mental and emotional well-being, but our physical health as well. And then if you add on top of that any kind of mistrust in the medical system, if people are less likely to get health care, whether because they have mistrust, they're a little bit like nervous, they feel like they are shamed, they maybe don't have the resources, transportation, or even the insurance, any of that to get that medical help, they're also going to be at a higher risk for those conditions. And so you have this kind of everything just being like thrown at weight. Like it's just such a lazy way of looking at everything without actually taking that step back and being like, why are these diseases, these conditions happening? Is there another possible way that these are happening when we have people at a higher weight who are very metabolically healthy, when we have people at a lower weight who are not metabolically healthy? Can we see that there might be other reasons why this might be happening? We are just, when we're talking about application, we are on much firmer ground when we promote those lifestyle changes versus saying diet and exercise. Anytime you have any kind of lifestyle change, if you're specifically having lifestyle improvements, you might very well see a decrease in your weight. You might see that weight change, but that's not a given. If there is this kind of long-term sustainable weight change, then it's typically due to actions that are being implemented that support physical, mental, social, and emotional well-being. If somebody says, for instance, that they have been working with a dietitian or other qualified health professional and they have found themselves at a lower weight than maybe what they were before, and at the same time they're doing actions that are really giving them a good amount of energy, they're providing them with food that tastes good, that makes them feel good, they're pretty much implementing this framework around the intuitive eating framework, they're overall feeling better, more than likely it's because their lifestyle changes are now aligned with actions that support that physical, mental, social, and emotional well-being. And so I'm not going to say that you can't have a weight change from implementing actions that are healthy, but I can't guarantee that kind of weight loss just because we're doing those actions. But at the same time, if you're feeling better, it's typically not because of the weight that is lost, but because you have implemented all of these actions that we know, we have solid information that actually does help us with our health and helps us reduce those risk factors for those cardiovascular and metabolic conditions. So if it has such a poor outcome, dieting in general, if it has such a poor outcome, even though there are some outliers, why are we promoting it? Why are we recommending it? This is why so many people, health professional and non-health professional, are moving to that health at every size framework. The dieting industry basically survived by telling us that we're not good enough, but if we buy their product, then we will be. If we buy their products, we will become beautiful. Remember, this is a $59 billion industry. At both extremes, a high body weight and a low body weight adversely affects health. But encouraging weight loss as this kind of first line of defense for health is just bad science. It's lazy. It is just lazy to say. Everyone, fat and thin, can reduce their risk for health conditions without focusing on weight. And if you don't want to focus on your health conditions or like reducing health risks, that's okay. Like that is up to you. I'm not going to shame anybody or scare anybody into health. But what I am saying is that anybody can reduce their risk without focusing on that weight piece. So a way of application that supports people in creating these habits that are sustainable, that promote that reduction in chronic health condition risk, that is the foundation. That is health at every size. You don't owe the pursuit of health to anybody. You know, you have the right to have that body autonomy. But if you want to get healthier, we can do that without focusing on weight. I can't say that enough. And just remember that it's not called healthy at every size. So the next time I hear somebody say like, you can't be healthy at every size, like, no shit, Sherlock. Nobody is saying that. Nobody is saying that you can be healthy at every size. Literally, anybody who comes back with that kind of argument of, well, you can't be healthy at every size, that tells you that they have zero idea of what they're talking about, because it is not called healthy at every size. It is health at every size. And diets, in my opinion, are very cult-like. They lure you in with this kind of sense of community. They keep you in by saying like, this is the way that you need to do things. Everybody else is wrong. They kind of scare you of leaving, like, what happens when you leave, like, this is the way of life. Diets can become cults, in my opinion. And in general, diet culture is just exhausting. I can't wait until we all just collectively focus on doing actions that support our health. When we talk about how eating brings us joy, when we talk about how we can enjoy certain foods and still have a very healthy lifestyle, that we're not gonna say like, oh, I ate this ice cream or this cookie or all of this cake, like I'm gonna get diabetes now. When we can stop doing things like that, where we can celebrate having this kind of healthy relationship with food, and where we don't find ourselves going back and forth between binging and dieting, or like this kind of binging and restriction. And also to touch a little bit on body positivity. Body positivity doesn't mean loving your body and like how it looks at all times. Body positivity is more about the idea of supporting people who are in marginalized bodies, supporting the idea that people are treated with respect and that they are listened to, that they're not just told by their doctors or by the society to lose weight and exercise. Hi folks, just wanted to come in here and kind of summarize basically everything I was trying to get across. I want to make sure that it's just not confusing, because I kind of went on some tangents. So nobody is saying that you can be healthy at every size. Remember that. It stands for health at every size. And the health at every size principles, they're put up on the screen. So that includes weight inclusivity, which is to accept and respect the inherent diversity of body shapes and sizes, and rejecting the idealization and pathologizing of specific weights. There is health enhancement, so support health policies that improve and equalize access to information and services, and personal practices that improve human well-being, including attention to individual physical, economical, social, spiritual, emotional, and other needs. There's also eating for well-being, so promote flexible, individualized eating based on hunger, satiety, nutritional needs, and pleasure, rather than any externally regulated eating plan focused on weight control. There's also respectful care, so acknowledge our biases and work to end weight discrimination, weight stigma, weight bias. Provide information and services from an understanding that socioeconomic status, race, gender, sexual orientation, age, and other identities impact weight stigma, and support environments that address these inequities. And then also life-enhancing movement, so supporting physical activities that allow people of all sizes, abilities, and interests to engage in enjoyable movement to the degree that they choose. So with all of these principles, we can clearly see that the focus is still on supporting people in moving to a healthy place. And so if somebody is really against health at every size, I like to show them these principles, because it is showing at the foundation that we do want to improve the access to those personal practices that improve overall well-being, which includes physical health. Other things I wanted to mention as I summarize: so we do see benefit from weight neutral actions. Evidence shows that weight cycling in the long run can be damaging to the body, not just mentally, but physically, than other people at similar weights without that weight cycling. And lastly, I cannot stress this enough, because this seems to be the main argument. Nobody is saying that high levels of fat is without any concern. We're just more focused on outcome and what you do with that information, and based on evidence, what works better long term. And also guilt and shame and trying to scare somebody into health. Evidence shows that doesn't really work. especially long term. We can't shame them and guilt them into health if we want them to really take hold of those practices that support their well-being. So when companies and coaches like BeachBody say that they don't do diets, that they're against diets, or that they don't believe in diets, I get really frustrated. Just look at this example. Recently posted on their Instagram, says, "Welcome to BeachBody On Demand, an online streaming service that allows you to stream hundreds of programs from top talent such as blah 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 and many more. We also offer 2 incredible nutrition programs, To Be Mindset and Portion Fix, because we don't believe in diets. We believe in healthy eating for the long term." Yeah, that is BS, because those programs are still diets. If you have not watched my deep dive on BeachBody or even the one on To Be Mindset, check that out. To Be Mindset, I feel like after really doing that video, thinking about it more, I feel like it is even worse, potentially, in my opinion, than the 21-day fix, because it specifically, it's selling itself that it's not a diet, versus the other program that is still, you would still consider it, most people would consider it a diet. A lot of people are looking at the To Be Mindset as if it's not a diet, when it really is. So it makes it even more insidious, in my opinion. So check out that video if you haven't watched that yet. So instead of feeling like you need to follow a diet or this kind of macro plan or these rules, anything like that, I wanted to leave you with some potential ideas at what I have found in people who consistently have a healthy relationship with food and their body, what I have kind of seen as the string that kind of holds them together in that way, and who generally are practicing those actions that support physical, mental, social, and emotional well-being. So the first one is to really approach food with curiosity, compassion, and context, and also with food neutrality. So asking, what do I want? Why do I want this? Is there a kind of a chain or a trigger for me wanting this? What is my day looking like? What do I need this food to do for me? What do I feel like having? What am I craving? What kind of texture, flavor, taste, the temperature, the mouthfeel overall? How can I give my body what maybe it needs most right now? Just approaching that food with curiosity of what's going on, with compassion of, maybe you are feeling a little bit more emotional. That is okay. You can have compassion. It's important to have that compassion for yourself, regardless of the situation. And also the context of, what do I need this food to do for me? Do I need to have it provide me energy for the next 5-6 hours that I won't be able to eat? Or do I want just this kind of small little increase in energy? Do I need to go run? Am I planning on going on a run or doing some lifting? Do I need a little bit extra fuel for that? So really looking at the context and overall food neutrality, which we've talked about many times on this channel. Food is neutral. Sometimes the most healthiest food, or a food that someone might consider healthy at all times, like kale, that's not going to be very helpful right before you're trying to do your heaviest deadlift or squat, or when you're going to run a marathon. Kale is not going to be the healthiest option. You're probably going to pass out if you have kale at that point. At that time, having something that is higher glycemic, higher amounts of sugar, your body is going to be able to break that down a little bit faster and use that for energy. That is going to be the healthier option. So really looking at the situation at hand. The next thing is recognizing hunger and fullness cues. Now, if you are not careful, the hunger and fullness can become a diet in itself, of only eating when you're hungry and having to stop when you're full and feeling guilty if you go a little bit beyond that. That is not what I mean, and that is not what we need to do. We don't need to make this into a diet. The more that we are able to really learn how to read those cues, the more aligned with our bodies that will be, and those cues can become louder and more easily understood. Now, also note, years of dieting can really make it hard to listen to or understand those cues, so that might take a lot of intentional work, kind of learning how to listen to those again. The next one is choosing food that support your whole health. So not just talking about your physical health, but also your emotional, social, and mental well-being. And so yes, at times lives, this can include more of those fun foods. And just seeing how all foods, including those that are very nutrient dense, can have very intentional and joyful places in our lives. Looking at foods for most of the time, going to foods kind of back to the basics where it has as little kind of human interaction as possible, that's generally going to support you well, typically. And then also creating a plan of care. So this is one that I really love to have people implement, especially people who are always running around, because it's not really a factor of if you're going to need that plan of care. It's more like when are you going to need that plan of care. So this includes having kind of backup foods to help support you, to nourish you, especially when you just don't have time to maybe do that kind of preparation of food. And so examples might be having some frozen meals that you really like having that you just have to heat up really quick, or having other kind of snacks that you can put together, make them into kind of a meal if needed. And the backup plan can also include having some like emotional support work that kind of calms you back down, brings you back down. This can be something that can be done with help along with a mental health professional. So just non-harmful exercises that can kind of ground you again. The only rule of having this backup, this plan of care, is that perfection cannot be a measure of success. So it's the backup, perfection not allowed. We're just talking about having that kind of plan that has your back when life is a little bit more challenging. As a kind of wrap up, I'll say that the most important thing that when people ask like, what do I look for? What do I do with nutrition? Like, how do I know if it's a good program or anything like that? I would say that always be skeptical of any kind of dogma, of any kind of nutrition, anything that is saying that this is the diet, the plan that will cure everything. Dogma is the enemy when it comes to science. And so nutrition is a science, and so we need to be aware of when things become dogma. And most of the time you'll find those in any kind of fad diet or any kind of really popular programs. I will say that's another big red flag. If something is very, very popular, especially within nutrition, like, just be a little bit skeptical, because a lot of times the programs or the things that are the most loud, there's kind of a reason why they got there. And most of the time it's not for the most ethical of reasons why they're so popular, why they got up there. So just kind of leaving you with that. If you like this video, please hit the like button and make sure that you're subscribed. I appreciate all of the support that you provide me. The next video will be another MLM deep dive, so be on the lookout for that, and I'll see you next time. All right, bye.